Hi, thank you for that kind introduction. I hope everybody can hear me okay. I may be a little bit out of it because until next Monday, I am associate professor of East Asian Studies, even though I primarily research and teach digital humanities these days at Seoul National University. And as of the 1st of August, I will relocate to Hong Kong. I will be, to my knowledge, Hong Kong's first full-time faculty hired specifically to research and teach digital humanities and to train, to my knowledge, starting this coming academic year, we have a new Bachelor of Arts program that is called Humanities in Digital Technologies. So I'll be teaching in that program. So until the Monday, I'm based in Seoul. This weekend, I will move to Hong Kong, and hopefully we can stay in touch and let this networking and this relationship with Latvia and also the Baltic states at large continue. As I was introduced by Anda, I'm an intellectual historian of medieval Korea, and I've been a practitioner of the digital humanities thanks to the introduction to this wonderful field by Professor Peter Ball at Harvard. Some of you may have heard, if you've been active in the digital humanities community, you may have heard of the project called China Biographical Database Project, called CBDB. He has been the director of the project for a long time. So through my advisor on the China side, he introduced me to digital humanities, so I've been a practitioner since then. And today's topic is mainly about something like this, more of a conventional approach. So I have two major research areas when it comes to digital humanities. One is trying to figure out what innovative and effective methods we can develop as the source materials. So as when I began graduate school, my primary sources were still primarily in this form, large collections of printed materials. Some of them are reprints of medieval and early modern print codex. But over time, since around 2005, increasingly, primary sources have been scanned, typed, and also verified for accuracy, translated, and eventually made accessible to researchers via databases and large-scale portals. And in the case of Korean studies, as you can imagine, South Korea is famous around the world as one of the leaders in IT technologies and digital cultures. The same applies to the areas related to the humanities. So most primary sources these days, so researchers, when we begin our research questions, we never pick up a book. We always begin our research with databases. I have another research area called big data studies, which has more to do with contemporary production of what we call big data today, usually non-textual, non-structured, unstructured, very large scale data production happening today. And I inquire what new historical questions we need to ask in this new context we're dealing with from the perspective of somebody who studies the Middle Ages in East Asia. So I look at it from a very long-term perspective, 500 to 1,000 years. In what ways do historians need to prepare so that when the 21st century becomes the distant past, what kind of research will be made possible and what kind of preparation we need to engage in at this point. But today I will talk about mainly more the traditional approach to digital humanities, which is also one of my major research areas, and in fact something that I spent a lot of time contemplating since graduate school, since 2008 when I entered this domain called digital humanities. Today's talk I'll try my best to wrap up in about 40 minutes from now. I'll just cover 3 points. Otherwise I can just go on forever because there's so much to cover. So I'll give you a brief overview about the origins of digital Korean studies, because I imagine most people here are not familiar with when digitization and when digital methods were introduced to the field of Korean studies. And then I'll talk a little more broadly. So I'll step outside of my primary domain and engage with you from the perspective of digital historical scholarship and what specific challenges I've noticed over the course of more than a decade of engagement with this type of approach. And third, I will talk about an effective and robust way of building a digital platform. So the technology I will introduce today, I'll eventually get to this. What exactly is this? And why I made some choices along the way, and why I chose this particular way of organizing my digitized data, which comes to me in this form, and I transport this into this, which is a graph database management system called Neo4j. So it's a graph-driven database platform, and I'll explain briefly, as concisely as possible, explain how I arrived at this conclusion and what kind of new queries and what kind of new research questions I can ask as a thanks to the creation of this this new approach. If you're interested in some more details, I also have a YouTube video on the origins of digital Korean studies. So there are some materials that eventually, after about, I think it was like 6 or 7 years, I've been giving the same talk, and I decided to retire most of the contents and not repeat myself anymore. I got so sick of hearing me talking about the same things over and over again. But I will talk a little bit about, since for many of you, Korean studies will be new, I will take some tidbits from this lecture today, and I will recycle a little bit. But if you're interested in more details, the extended version is all available on YouTube. You can just search for my name, Javier Chao, on YouTube. I only have 2 YouTube lectures. I'm not very active on YouTube. It'll be easy to find this. So the beginnings of digital Korean studies has it goes back to the 1960s. It's really surprising how far back it goes. So those of you who are familiar with Josephine Miles, talking 1940s, Roberto Busa, I think was 49 when he first met the CEO of IBM, Watson. And I think the actual start to the Index Thomisticus project was in the 60s. So around the same time, there were 2 historians of Korea, one based at Harvard. This is Edward Wagner. He is, in East Asia, in East Asian studies, we care a lot about genealogies, including intellectual genealogies. So if you trace back my intellectual ancestry, he is my intellectual great-grandfather. He's my advisor's advisor at Harvard. 1960s, he was the first professor of Korean history at Harvard. And he, in 1964, welcomed a visitor from South Korea. His name is Song Junho. And Professor Song was originally a historian of China, but as a Korean himself, and as somebody who could read classical Chinese sources, he was interested in collecting source materials and reconstructing the power structure of 15th and 16th century Korean society, which also happened to be Professor Wagner's dissertation topic. It was about 15th century power struggles in the Korean court. Initially, he was very interested in using I think Harvard's name value and access to large funds to go around and collect materials. As you can imagine, 1960s South Korea was still a very poor country. It was soon after the Korean War, and after 36 years of colonization, historical materials were scattered all over the world. Some of them were in the United States, some of them were in Europe, some of them were in Japan, and even the ones in South Korea were not organized properly. So he was mainly interested in organizing all these scattered pieces. But Edward Wagner had a different approach to this. He said, in the United States, there's this computing boom happening. So he suggested to Song Junho, why don't we use computers and turn this project into a database project, which is incredible. We're talking 1960s. And right away, they ran into all kinds of issues. And I introduced these issues to you because I think there's a lot of text analysis happening in your summer school this week. So in the case of Korean studies, is by definition a multilingual and multi-script discipline. And I think this is not really surprising to many of you who are working with Eastern European sources. But we're also talking about multiple language families here. I think that's maybe one difference between what you encounter in Eastern Europe versus Korean studies. But I guess in the case of the Baltic state, you might also have to deal with multiple scripts. So we have not only alphabetic scripts, but Sinitic scripts, so Chinese characters, what we usually colloquially call. So a lot of classical Chinese sources are in Sinitic characters like this. And you also have, of course, the phonetic Hangul text. So it looks like this. And one thing really interesting about Korean sources, textual sources, is that there are two input methods, and the two input methods result in two very different ways of representing the text in digital form. One is called two-set, which is the most typical way of inputting Korean phonetic text. But there's also something called three-set, which comes from, if you look at this, some of you may have guessed already, but this is coming from typewriter days. So Korean has initial, vowel, and a final. And for typewriters, the initial, vowel, and the final parts were all they basically belong to different types on the typewriter. So the three-set input system retains the legacy typewriters, whereas the two-set is more like a born digital way of inputting source Korean textual source materials. So this Munka project began in the 60s, continued for about 40 years. And in the meantime, there were also other scholars and a businessman, an academic / businessman, who was inspired by the legacy of what Wagner and Song Junho had created, and wanted to do something different, but using computing as well. They were inspired by their innovative uses and early uses of computing. So in the 1980s, there is this figure, he's Professor Kim Hyun, at the Academy of Korean Studies, basically the mastermind behind a lot of the digitized archive we see in Korean studies today. As you can see here, he's a very peculiar and interesting and eccentric character. He's a very artisanal type, you might say. He creates his own flute. So he basically literally cuts down bamboo trees, straightens it, tunes it, and he just loves making things. He's also one of the most innovative figures in digital Korean studies. Back in the 1980s, he was writing a dissertation on Korean Neo-Confucian philosophy, about key philosophy. It can't be more traditional than that. But he got interested in encoding issues when he got involved in a digital dictionary project that basically is a dictionary project for Sinitic characters to modern standard Korean. And because it involved a lot of digital work, he got interested in text encoding issues. And after training for about 10 years, he became one of the leading experts in South Korea in text encoding issues. And with this knowledge, he tried to do something that even Wagner and Song were not able to do so. And so to do this, he partnered up with a former academic, this Lee Young-gun, who was a professor at my current institution at Seoul National University in the Graduate School of Public Administration. And but for some details that I don't want to get into too much, there were some political issues. He eventually left academia during in South Korea's dark days of dictatorship, military dictatorship, and became a businessman who was really good at fundraising for academic projects. So what they proceeded to do is digitize the entire 500 plus year long daily records of the Joseon Dynasty court. This is the early modern Korean kingdom. So from 1392 to 1910, we have detailed daily accounts of the conversations that took place between the king and his ministers in the Korean peninsula. So in the 1990s, Kim Hyun creates for the first time a CD-ROM edition of the Annals of the Joseon Dynasty, which later it gets sold to the Institute of Institute of Korean History. I forgot the exact name, but it's an institution that is in charge, government-funded institution is in charge of providing access to historical source materials of this kind. Initially, it was only capable of doing simple keyword text searches, but as I will demonstrate later in this talk, it is now capable of doing something much more advanced because the backend is a set of very detailed, very thoroughly annotated set of XML documents. And then something else happened as Kim Hyun was partnering up with a businessman like Lee Eun-gun, and through a startup company published like the digital edition of the Annals of the Joseon Dynasty. Something happened in South Korea, which those of us were worried about the global economic situation these days might find relatable. So in 1997, South Korea was experiencing a very high point in economic development. Koreans were very, very proud that, through hard work and through decades of economic development through manufacturing, reached a certain level of economic development until the something called the IMF crisis, the Asian financial crisis, sweeps across East and Southeast Asia. So suddenly, South Koreans find themselves in an economic recession, a major economic recession. And what happens during this time of economic recession is that the government implements a stimulus package, which initially was meant to go to infrastructure building, in fact, physical infrastructure building like highways, roads, construction, and so on. But because South Korea was already a very developed economy, many people, and in many cases, because South Korea tends to be very patriarchal, many of them were men who had white-collar jobs, were unwilling to go out and take on blue-collar work. So they appealed to the government and said, can we do something different that involves desk work? So all that money, the millions of dollars that were allocated to infrastructure building, went to digital heritage construction. So basically what they did is they had thousands of people who were unemployed and told them, now you have a desk job and your task is to digitize Korea's rich cultural heritage. And as you can see here, tens of millions of euro has been allocated to this agenda alone. So we're talking hundreds of millions of euro invested into the digitization of cultural heritage for more than 25 years. So as a result of all that, researchers today no longer use printed source materials, but we access our information via these platforms, which is open not only to South Koreans, but any researcher interested in Korea, as long as you can read the materials. And not only textual sources, but museum heritage collections, like the 8,000 plus items at the central location of the National Museum of Korea. The entire thing is available to researchers. And in the case of Korean history, more than 100 databases are provided to researchers in open access on the web like this via a very nice interface for doing all kinds of advanced searches. And what is remarkable about, to me, what is remarkable about Korean studies, and I'm sure many of you will agree with me, is that the raw data files are downloadable thanks to a bill that passed circa 2014. So something called the Korea Open Government License that was in discussion from 2011 to 2013, and eventually becomes officially passes in 2014, stipulates that any publicly funded digital project, digitization project that was paid for by South Korean taxpayer money has to be made available to the general public, officially to South Korean citizens only. But if you're not a South Korean citizen, in my case, I'm a Canadian citizen. So technically, this is not given to me for the purpose of me using this material. But if I ask a Korean friend with a Korean passport, any Korean citizen can request this, and the institutions are obligated to share the raw data files. And by raw data files, I mean the the entire like XML, the full text, or RDF, any file format that they create, they are obligated to share it with the Korean public. Okay. So to recap, this is what happened. Early start in 1960s, and encoding issues that the pioneers had to deal with. 1980s, you had Kim Hyun interest in digital dictionaries. 1990s, CD-ROM version of the annals of the Joseon Dynasty, and something that happened during the Asian financial crisis. We end up with all these wonderful databases available to researchers and downloadable to thanks to the open license bill that passes in 2014. Okay. Now I want to move on to the second part of my talk, which is about what to do with all this. So in the context of my field, my primary field, which is Korean history, we don't talk so much about digitization of oral CR because the raw data are already there. So for me, the question has always, for a long time, has been, how do I access, not how I access the data or how I do OCR to extract information from scanned pages, but rather when I have so much really high quality and rich digitized information sources, what do I do with these things? So to tackle this question, I can approach it in multiple ways, but maybe just to simplify, and because many of you are already experts in digital humanities, I won't dwell on this too long. I think you can think of it in here. So my screen sharing stopped for some reason. Okay. So the two major tracks in the digital humanities, one is competition literary studies, which there are many ways of writing this history, but I think many of us, I think it's safe to say many of us will agree that one of the pioneers in this particular subfield is Josephine Miles, who was the first woman to be tenured at UC Berkeley, used punch cards with her graduate students to analyze Irish poems, statistical analysis of Irish poems. And we have another pioneers, and I introduced two of them today, right? One is the more well-known figure, Roberto Buza, who is formally not an academic, but somebody very important in the field of digital humanities, a Jesuit priest interested in Thomas Aquinas, got the support of IBM to create an archive. So rather than focusing on the computing potential of computers, of digital technologies, he was more interested in creating digital archives. And you can see something very similar happening with Edward Wagner, with Song Junho, and also with these figures, the people who were inspired by the potential of CD-ROM in the 1990s, and later the ability to share and access information easily and in a very inexpensive way on the web. So you can say two aspects. One group of people who are more interested in the computing potential of digital technologies, and the other more on creating archives. And also think about all these debates happening, especially in the very heated debates happening in the subfield called competition literary studies. Like, is there a distinction between literary studies versus literary history? What is data-driven versus data-assisted scholarship? When you have a large corpus, how do we timestamp a corpus? And also all these issues of representation and archives. So starting from not only some of the earlier works of Franco Moretti and Matthew Jockers, if you are familiar with some of the more recent publications like Catherine Bode, Andrew Piper, Ted Underwood, and Hoyt Long, we can start debating about what exactly does it mean. Like, so if you follow Ted Underwood, to engage in something called quantitative humanities, to what extent should humanities scholars focus on quantitative methods? How do we make that, how is quantitative humanities different from quantitative social sciences? But if you look at people like Hoyt Long, who works on Japanese literature, and people like Catherine Bode, who works in English literature, but in the context of Australia, we get a very different approach to digital scholarship, where they're more interested in the collection of data and the representation of their corpus. So for those scholars who don't have access to Happy Trust, or those scholars for whom Happy Trust is not their main source of corpus, they have to build their own corpus. So in the case of Australia, Catherine Bode had to scan newspapers because Australian authors tended to serialize their publications of newspapers. So she had to begin literally with scanned newspaper pages running OCR, and then began to wonder about what exactly does it mean to do digital scholarship in this context, and also focus a lot on sampling issues, which is, I think, a reflection that is relatively absent, going back even to, I think, Moretti and Jockers. There's a very confident way that I think Moretti and Jockers, if you read their scholarship carefully, there's this assumption that whatever they're having access to, the corpus is so large that they think is a fairly good representation of everything that has ever been produced in the literary world. But if you follow Bode, or if you follow Hoyt Long, they're much more careful about what is being represented in their digital corpus, and there's a lot of extensive discussion about sampling issues. You can also think about data-driven versus data-assisted methodologies. This is discussed extensively in Miguel Escora Varela's Theater as Data, somebody who works on theater studies. But if you haven't read his book, it's open access through University of Michigan Press. I highly recommend it. There's an entire chapter dedicated to digital methods that I think should be discussed more openly and more extensively by those of us in the digital humanities community. In my case, I've been interested a lot in this notion of creating a digital macroscope for historical research. And this idea, so those of you who are familiar with Milligan, suddenly can't remember the other person, Milligan and Weingart and Graham. So the historian's macroscope, right? Exploring big historical data. There's a whole monograph co-authored by these three major figures in digital humanities, something called the Exploring Big Historical Data, the historian's macroscope. That term is not something that those three authors came up with. In fact, the person who popularized this in the digital humanities community is the information scientist Kathy Berner, in an article written in 2012, who said a macroscope intends to provide a vision of the whole, helping us synthesize the related elements and detect patterns, trends, and outliers while granting access to myriad details. And this idea, I don't think there's a direct connection between Berner and this historian in 1958, but it is an idea that was proposed multiple times in the academic world over the past few decades. So another historian named Philip Bagby in 1958 proposed that he wanted to create something called a macroscope. And here, he didn't have digital approaches in mind. He just kind of wished that there was something like this. I think he used it more like a metaphor rather than an actual concrete tool that we can create. So his definition of a macroscope is an instrument which would ensure that the historian will see only the larger aspects of history and blind them to the individual details, and maintain this higher level of abstraction and decipher the principal patterns of historical change. You can see a little bit of overlap with historical social sciences, and also this desire to not be distracted too much by the details, but try to pick up at a higher level of abstraction the broader patterns in historical change and in historical timeline. And Graham, Milligan, and Weingart also have their own definitions of macroscope. So with a macroscope, they hope to have, they define it as a different set of tools. And here they mean things that are standard package in digital humanities training these days, like Gephi, Cytoscape, even Neo4j, R, Python. So various tools that we use for exploring data in different scales. And I think this is very important here. It has to be very flexible, has to be very robust. It has to give you different points of view at different scales. So a macroscope is assumed from Kathy Berner on to be digital. And thanks to the power of digital technologies, it should provide us with an observation, what is once too great show or complex for the human eye and mind to notice and comprehend. Okay. So I also had a similar idea. Initially, when I entered the digital humanities field, I didn't think of my approach as, I didn't think that I was creating a microscope. But I think many of us end up doing something like this. Right? So just to illustrate my point, this is kind of like what I did. So when I first entered digital humanities, the semester before I officially entered this field, I wrote a seminar paper on Korean intellectual figures in the 15th century. And by chance, I was just rummaging through the pages of an intellectual biographic dictionary and found all kinds of connections among these like 10 or 11 figures that were very important in my seminar paper. And then I got curious, like these guys are all interconnected. So is this a part of a broader network, or what exactly is it? Is there a way of doing this in a different way? As you can see, I used basically very rudimentary. I used Microsoft Word to draw these things using a table. I have a background in web design, so I was thinking kind of like HTML table and borders and whatever. I drew this by hand. And later when I learned Cytoscape and Gephi, I noticed, oh gosh, this is a part of a much larger network, and not only simply much larger, but we're talking like maybe 3,000 plus nodes and edges. Okay? So you can do something like this using a digital macroscope. And this is basically Wagner's examination database. So something that was built since the 1960s, available to us now on open access. You can visualize the connections among those individuals using either Gephi or Cytoscape, depending on your choice of software. And you can also add additional data to what you already have. So in my case, there are many genealogies that have survived in Korean history. So the 1465 edition of the Andong Kwon genealogy, I have a digital edition of this, so I try to visualize that. I also have stone inscriptions, basically tombstone inscriptions, which have very detailed kinship records about major figures, the aristocrats who passed away. So you can turn that into a data set and examine it. And with by collaborating with one of my former students who is a physicist, but a physicist who is interested in social issues, he's a type of social physicist. We try to do a time series network analysis of something, because the data set goes on for 500 years. So we try to use a time series approach to provide a summary of what happened across those 500 years, and try to make a very intuitive statistical summary of data sets that consist of maybe 20,000 plus nodes and edges. I try to track social mobility changes, although this is more like a proxy indicator. It's not exactly social mobility, but at least a proxy indicator. We can see that something that takes place before and after a devastating and a highly destructive war in 1592. 1592 is when Japan invades Korea, and the war lasts for about 7 years, highly destructive. And you can see that before and after the war, there's some drastic change in society happening, and this time series method picks it up. There's another thing I also experimented with, which takes genealogical data and also epitaphs, the tombstone inscriptions. And one thing I noticed in genealogical data that you don't really see, or you don't often see in social network data, the usual like friendship network data, is that marriage network data has a lot more restrictions, because I'm sure this is common in most societies, but in East Asia, traditionally, if you're a Confucian society, one male is allowed to have multiple partners, multiple concubines, but legally, you're allowed to have one wife. In the case of China, it's a little more complicated, but in Korea, it was much more strict. So legally, only one wife was recognized as legal. And because of that restriction, and because many major aristocratic lineages try to intermarry among their close circle, but at the same time didn't want to make the marriage too endogamous, you find that when you visualize it, you identify the existence of these very interesting rings of edges. So this is something that in Cytoscape, this is something you also observe in R. And you can use Python's NetworkX to extract those rings. So anything that goes in a full circle, with NetworkX, now you're able to extract what those rings are. So I've tried something like that as well. But there, all these approaches look very interesting. And for, I think, newcomers of digital humanities, looks impressive, apparently. But in terms of historical scholarship, there are some major limitations to this approach. As you notice in all these examples, basically what they're doing is exploratory data analysis of only one particular digitized historical source material. So this is the Wagner database visualized. This is another representation of the same data set. And this is a particular set of genealogies. But it is very difficult to make observations across multiple databases. And you see this limit recognized by some other digital historians as well. And you notice some similar observations that can be made in other major scholarship in digital history. So to give you one example, Robert Nelson's Mining Dispatch. It's a wonderful project based in the University of Richmond. They digitized a local newspaper called the Dispatch. And in the 19th century, and for those of us familiar with American history, this is a time of the American Civil War and the emancipation of slavery. So there are a lot of references to slavery and also patriotism. And we even find like literary pieces being published there. So they basically run topic models on this particular collection called the Dispatch. So the question becomes, is this project basically a macroscopic view of this collection, this newspaper called the Dispatch, or is it telling us something about this particular area of the United States at large? You can say the same thing about this, which is another wonderful article and happens to be a good friend of mine. So I want to be a little careful with the way I phrase this. But you also see in Ian Miller's Rebellion, Crime, and Violence in Qing China, basically a topic modeling of state-related outbreaks of violence from 1722 to 1911 using basically the Chinese equivalent of the daily court accounts. It's called the Shulu, the veritable records of the Qing dynasty. So the emperor's daily audience with his officials, and using the extensive corpus that covers roughly 200 years, he runs topic modeling on it to make an interesting argument. But Ian Miller also points out the limitations to this approach. And among the many limitations, he also recognizes that this is basically a reflection of an observation being made in Beijing using this particular corpus. So in many cases in digital historical scholarship, we're limited to analysis of a particular corpus. But that is not usually how historians approach a research project. If you imagine, like, if in a non-digital context, if our article or our book basically relies on just one set of primary source materials, we will find that very suspicious. Like, what is going on? You only look at the Beijing's perspective. Why don't you look at other sources, right? Generally, in non-digital context, historical scholarship involves extensive uses of hundreds of observations being made about the particular topic. But in digital historical scholarship, when we create our Microscope, we tend to limit our perspective to one set of digitized source materials, one digitized repository. And I can continue the discussion of various problems that arise when we handle digitized editions of our primary sources. I don't want to go on into too much detail because I think I'm running out of time soon. But you can also do what tends to be also absent in digital historical scholarship is source criticism. So before the digital archive became a digital archive, we need to think about from where did this particular information come from, and is it reliable, and are there any conflicting information? So in the case of Wagner's examination database, we see that there's a reference to that destructive war in 1592 right away. So what happened during the war is that anything that was created, so a lot of the records, exam records created before 1592 was basically wiped clean. So any examination records, state examination records from before 1592 was destroyed. So pre-1592 records were reconstructed from memory. So we need to think about this. In today's digital archive, if we don't engage in source criticism, we don't know this. But as a historian, you need to think about this. This is very serious. It was reconstructed from memory in the post-war period. Okay? So it was restored by people with apparently excellent memory. So can we trust it? So when I do this, is this trustworthy? Method-wise, I thought it was interesting. Right? Well, I pointed this out in the article too. Can we trust? You can maybe trust the analysis, but can we trust the data? Because it was restored in the post-war period. We also noticed during the post-war period, the examination records, the original materials that survived to this day, and then later became a digital version that we use today, what that scholars use today, came in multiple editions. They were state-sanctioned official records, and there are also commercial editions. And one big difference between the two is that once in a while you find conflicting information. So somebody's name may have been spelled differently, or some records don't match. So you think about when you have conflicting information, how do you resolve that? But also the commercial editions, because it's commercial, they're being sold. You think about why did people in the 18th and 19th century interested in purchasing basically what is a list of names? And because they were commercial editions, the vendors have to make it, the publisher has to make it interesting. So the commercial editions, as you see here, comes with extensive commentaries and interesting stories pertaining to those individuals, which is absent in the official government edition. But in today's digital edition, these stories are absent. So somebody made this choice. Somebody decided not to include these stories in the digital editions today, and basically make the government edition as the foundational text for today's digital edition. We also find something that colloquially we call data contamination in digital historical scholarship. What I mean by this is basically that we take information from centralized digital repositories provided to us by through official channels, but most scholars don't simply take that and use them as face value. We end up usually creating our own versions, our own data set based on the information that we downloaded through those official channels. So this is my Javier Chas version of the examination records. And as you can see, as a medievalist, I tend not to look at anything past 1700. Even that is very late for me. Usually the latest information I look at is like 1570s and 1580s. But I do a lot of cleanup. And you can also think about like, what do I mean by cleanup? When you have conflicting information or when you have encoding errors, I tend to correct them, but in most cases, I don't introduce the correction back to the centralized repository. So Javier Chas creates Javier Chas' own edition of the examination records. And this is my colleague Park Hyun-soon at Seoul National University, who is less interested in the Middle Ages and more interested in the early modern period. So her interest tends to begin in the 1700s. And she has her own corrections. So there's a part edition of the same digital archive. So how do we reconcile this? What are the implications of all this? I'm sure many of you can relate to the stories I'm telling you today. It doesn't have to be specific to Korean history, but I'm sure happening in the context of other digital historical scholars happening elsewhere. We also have the problem with data heterogeneity, where the survival of materials before and after 1592 is incredible. There's just so much more information that survived in Korean history post 1592 versus pre. And the data format tends to be heterogeneous as well. So the format that Korean historical archives tend to come is XML, but not all databases when you download the raw data, are designed in XML. Some are in the form of RDF, some are in the form of relational databases, some, and as you can see, sometimes we also use other types of database management technologies. So as a resolution of all this, I came up with this notion because, especially in the context of digital Islamic studies, this notion of text reuse, it was coined from what I know, people who do Islamic studies, basically to study the commentarial traditions in the Islamic world, which you can also apply to, I think, to the Confucian tradition of adding commentaries and study that computationally. But in my case, I was thinking, can we reuse portions of relevant data sources for my specific research question, combine them all, and in the case of medieval studies, so one thing I tend to find myself doing over and over is that I'm a specialist of the time period that precedes 1592, this period. But because the survival rate of post-1592 data is so much better, I kept finding myself doing digital scholarship using sources from a time period that I'm not so interested in, right? Early modern period is okay, also okay, but I'm primarily a medievalist. So I thought, what do I do to study this? Very little has survived, and to do good scholarship with such a small quantity of data. So my approach was to take as much information as possible from multiple sources and engage in something called central database management using this graph database, which is one of the most common use cases for this database platform. Something called Neo4j to increase the density of connections as much as possible across entities that pertain to the pre-1592 time period. So try to overcome this issue with unwieldy macroscopes. So this is a Gephi representation, a cytoscape representation of the examination database, a Gephi representation of the entire thing, 500 years. But I wanted to move beyond this. So one thing you can do is using cytoscape, maybe zero in on a specific node and do selections. So in cytoscape, you can do this rather easily. You can choose adjacent nodes and adjacent edges, pull out a subnetwork and study those subnetworks manually in a non-digital way, but use digital tools to extract what you think might be interesting from the visualization. But I thought there must be a more effective way of doing this, something more interesting, something more efficient, and something more robust. So I came up with this idea called Medieval Yangban Project, and the data sets used for this can be found in my GitHub page. I haven't updated it for a while, but I will update it with a new version pretty soon when it's ready. So basically, I draw relevant data sources for corresponding to the medieval time period. And Yangban here is a Korean term for aristocrats, people who served in the central bureaucratic offices. So the idea is to increase the edge density across these nodes as much as possible and run cipher queries to enable discovery of things that historians may have missed when we did our historical scholarship in a traditional way. So this kind of thing becomes possible. The nodes don't have to be necessarily human figures, don't have to be historical figures. They can be also references to bibliographic information, references to whether or not these people left behind private writings, or whether or not these figures were given prestigious titles. So you can do queries of this kind, and even indirectly in the database management system, you can do some basic visualizations and try to extract subsets of information corresponding to the specific queries that are done in a native graph way. So here is an example of, in 1392, there's dynastic change, regime change. So post-regime change, were the civil bureaucrats, the major civil bureaucrats, post-regime change, were they intermarrying to each other? And you can kind of see that, yes, indeed, they're intermarrying with one another. So here, it looks a bit messy, but it is possible also to pull this out as a CSV output of all the nodes corresponding that are shown here in a visual way. And right away, you can do a comparison, civil versus military figures. So post-regime change, what you see here is that most major military figures either left behind very little or no records about their kinship information, or I think what most likely happened was that they were purged. So they didn't left behind offspring. So right away, you can see civil versus military difference post-regime change. And you can also do something a little more complicated. There were some, in Korean history, there were prestigious titles given to officials who, during times of political turmoil, if you join the right camp and you win, if your hedging turns out to be correct, you're given this very prestigious investiture called merit subjects. You're meritorious, you're a very loyal and meritorious person. And between the 1327 and 1589, there were something like, I think nearly 40 instances. I need to check my records again, but there are many instances. And Edward Wagner originally was interested in the marriage subjects of 1392, 1398, all the way to 1504 and 1519, and ended there. So one thing I wanted to do is explore marriage subjects that in the conventional scholarship, historians have tended to ignore, like the marriage subjects of 1589, and see, is there a continuity between marriage subjects of 1469 and 1589? And this is the query output of that search. So you can choose all the marriage subjects of 1569 and all the marriage subjects of 1589 and see the connections. And if there's a particular long-term connection happening, you can identify who they are and try to find who exactly are they. And here you also notice multiple edges added. The multiple edges here don't mean that the centrality value is higher. The multiple edges here mean that there are, in this instance, this is confirming that this guy's name is Shin Suk-ju. This is Shin Jang. So Shin Suk-ju is Shin Jang's son. And 3 data sources confirm that Shin Suk-ju is his son. So if you have 3 data sources confirming this, chances are this connection is a pretty reliable connection. So it's not about centrality, but more about, okay, so I can kind of trust this. You know from where this connection was declared, and you can try to go back and check. But this kind of checking that you normally would have done by rummaging through dictionary pages can be done within the context of Neo4j, and also can be done, can also place these connections in the context of broader patterns that you can see through this kind of output as well. Normally, when I give this kind of talk, I also do a demo of Neo4j, but to do all this, it takes a long time, so I'm going to skip this part. I'm going to just end my presentation here, and I think it'd be more productive if we switch over to Q&A. Thank you for listening.